Hey there, viewers. Sometimes a case drags on, but other times, one hearing is all it takes to end it for good. Today, the judge revealed horrifying new details about Diddy's actions, and once they were out, there was no coming back. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. Another day, another trial. It started the way all mornings start around here, with the sharp sting of burnt coffee hanging in the air and the kind of stale heat that clings to your clothes no matter how early you show up. Manhattan Federal Court isn't glamorous like people on the outside imagine. There's no big show, no grand speeches in the hallway. It's fluorescent lights buzzing too loud overhead, papers slapping against worn-out desks, guards adjusting their belts, their boots squeaking across tile floors that haven't been waxed right in years. I got to my station around 6:30, same as every day. Clock in. Swipe the badge. Settle behind the thick glass of the records desk with a mug of coffee I didn't even want. The elevators kept hiccuping every few minutes, stuttering half open like they were afraid to let people out. I remember thinking even the building seemed nervous today, like it knew something I didn't. I've been assigned to every one of Combs' hearings so far. Bail hearings, discovery motions, all of it. When the case first landed here, you could feel the buzz rolling through the walls, guards whispering in the stairwells, journalists hanging around the lobby with their badges hidden behind fake smiles. People love to say they don't care about celebrity, but the second someone like Diddy walks into the building, everyone's heartbeat starts thudding just a little harder. At first, I treated it like any other high-profile case. Big names come and go through these halls. Half the time they throw enough lawyers at a problem until it vanishes into settlement agreements and sealed transcripts. That's what I thought would happen here too. Combs had money, influence. Whole cities probably owed him favors. But it didn't go that way. 3 times now, he's been denied bail. First hearing, they tried to paint him as a respected businessman with deep ties to the community. The judge barely flinched. Second time, they brought in character witnesses, dressed the man in suits so sharp you could cut yourself looking at them. Denied again. The third time, they didn't even try that hard. They just asked. Begged, almost. Denied once more. The paperwork from that last one was still warm when I filed it. By now, even the folks who usually try to stay neutral, people like me, could feel it. His defense wasn't working. Worse than that, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in, piece by piece, day by day. Today felt different though. Hard to explain. The coffee pot was burning by the time I passed the break room. A thick, ugly smell like something chemical breaking down. Court security was doubled. Not just more guards at the doors, but new ones, fresh faces, standing stiff like someone had barked at them to look sharp or get out. Their hands kept flexing around their belts. I saw 2 lieutenants arguing in hushed voices near the elevators. One of them looked like he'd lost sleep, eyes purpled underneath, collar unbuttoned. Nobody made eye contact. Not even the old-timers, the ones who could usually be counted on for a joke or a wink, something to cut the tension. It was like we were all underwater, hearing each other move, but not really speaking. I took my place behind the record counter and started running the day's checklist. Exhibit filings, cross-response forms, orders of appearance, motion responses. I kept my head down, but my ears were wide open. The whispers were worse than usual. One clerk said Combs's legal team was trying a new strategy, leaning into some kind of consensual adult lifestyle defense. Another said they'd tried to float an emergency motion late last night to seal even more evidence, claiming irreparable reputational harm. A few chuckled darkly at that. If you were sitting where we sat, watching the paperwork roll in like slow-moving hurricanes, you'd know reputation was the least of what was going to be harmed. Around 8, Judge Kaplan's clerk swept past my desk. That's when I saw it. The judge wasn't due to sit until 9:30. No reason for him to be here yet. But there he was, striding down the main hall, his robe half tucked under one arm, the other gripping a plain brown file folder like it was a live wire. No seal, no red tape, no official markings. Just a manila folder, thick and heavy, edges crumpled like it had already been read and reread a dozen times. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge anyone. He moved fast, like if he slowed down he might lose his nerve. I remember the sound his shoes made on the tile, not a heavy stomp, but a dry, scraping whisper, like pages being shredded underfoot. Right then, the first real shiver went through me. We all thought we knew what this was about. The freak-offs, the settlements, the tabloid scandals, open secrets whispered loud enough that even the walls could recite them. But seeing that file tucked under the judge's arm, seeing the grim, set line of his mouth, it felt like watching a surgeon walk into an operating room knowing the patient was already dead. That's when I knew something worse was coming. The minutes crawled. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, rechecking docket numbers, reprinting orders that didn't need reprinting, anything to stay busy, anything to keep my mind from wandering back to that damned folder. The usual press crowd started drifting in around 8:30. Faces I knew too well, some from the big stations, others from the niche sites that only cared about celebrity blood. They had that hungry look, not reporters anymore, but scavengers waiting for a body to drop. I watched them whisper among themselves, comparing notes, adjusting camera angles, even though no one was supposed to film inside the courtroom itself. It didn't matter. They all knew something was about to happen, even if they couldn't name it yet. By the time 9:15 rolled around, the gallery seats were almost full. And then, right on cue, the prisoner transport door buzzed open. Holmes shuffled in, shackled at the ankles and wrists, orange jumpsuit, thin paper shoes, the works. His skin looked waxy under the courtroom lights, the color of someone who hadn't seen real sun in a long time. He kept his head low, shoulders rounded in. This wasn't the puffed-up mogul from the glossy magazine covers. This was a man hollowed out by something worse than prison. He didn't scan the faces for allies or enemies. He just moved like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too many times. When he sat, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The judge took the bench without ceremony. No side glances, no clearing of the throat, just that plain brown file folder slammed down on the dais like a gavel before the gavel. And then it began. It would take days for the full meaning of that morning to sink in. Even now, I'm not sure the city's really caught up. But sitting there, hearing the first sheets of that folder being read into the record, quietly, methodically, like counting the dead, I realized something simple and terrifying. The trial wasn't about celebrity anymore. It wasn't even about justice. Not really. It was about memory. And whether or not we had the guts to admit that, we had seen it all along. By noon, it wouldn't matter who Diddy had been, how many records he sold, how many people kissed his ring. What mattered was what the judge was holding. And no amount of money, no army of lawyers, no private settlements whispered over champagne glasses could erase what was written inside those brown pages. The illusion was over. The reckoning had begun. Chapter 2. The memoir that wasn't supposed to exist. The court always smelled the same back in the archives, like old paper, stale air, and the faint bite of bleach someone forgot to rinse right. It was the kind of place no one wanted to linger, a maze of metal shelving and beige boxes stacked higher than most people could reach without a stepladder. They said it was temperature controlled, but you could feel the damp seeping into the files when you ran your fingers over them, like the building itself was trying to sweat something out. That morning, after the judge's session, I was summoned quietly. No announcement over the PA system, just a runner, young kid, fresh badge, sliding a slip of paper across my desk with a case number scrawled in heavy ink. No explanation, just a nod toward the back rooms. When you work in records long enough, you learn to recognize when something doesn't want to leave a paper trail. I clocked out of the main floor and punched in the secondary clearance code that led to the evidence archive, past the bulk file room, past the secured cabinets where we kept things nobody was supposed to even acknowledge existed. Old deposition tapes from defunct mob trials, sealed confessions from men who had mysteriously disappeared before their court dates. The usual. The package was waiting for me on the intake table. Brown courier envelope, no return address. Just a small white sticker. Case material. Cassie/Comps. Handwritten in neat, blocky letters. I signed it into the log like I was supposed to. Time, date, handler's initials. No instructions attached except one typed note. Ayahuasca submission to be sealed pending judicial review. There's a kind of reflex you get working a job like this. You don't ask questions. You don't open things unless you're told. You file, you seal, you forget. But the second my fingers brushed the envelope, I knew this one wasn't like the others. It felt wrong. Heavy and loose, like it was packed with things that didn't want to sit still. I took it to my workstation in the far corner, out of sight from the main security cameras. Nothing shady about it, just a habit. Some things you didn't want the rookie clerks seeing, even by accident. When I slid open the top, the first thing that fell out wasn't a file or an affidavit. It was a sheaf of handwritten pages, barely clipped together, some torn at the edges, a few smudged like they'd been crumpled and flattened again. A mess. It was across the first page, scribbled in blue ink. If they find this, I never wrote it. No title. No chapter numbers. No preface. Just a story that unspooled itself like a nerve fraying in slow motion. It wasn't clean, the way you'd expect a memoir to be. No polish, no ghostwriter smoothing the ugly into something palatable. It was more like a bleeding journal, raw and jagged, half sentences, lists, strange little diagrams of floor plans, clubs, hotels, private homes. One page was just a list of first names, initials crossed out and rewritten again and again, like she couldn't decide who to trust. And rest of stories. God help me, the stories. She wrote about the parties, the so-called freak-offs, in a way that made your skin crawl. Long rooms lined with mirrored walls. Music piped through hidden speakers, but always warped, always off-tempo, like the soundtrack to a nightmare you couldn't wake up from. Cassie described how the music would slow down until it sounded like voices muttering beneath the beats. She said that sometimes you couldn't tell whether the people moving around you were dancing or just being moved. She wrote about hidden doors at some of the houses, passages that led to private clinics, her words, where guests could be treated for whatever went wrong during the night. Overdoses, injuries, other things she didn't name directly, just hinted at with phrases like, when you break them too soon, and before they realize the price of admission. There were references to contracts too, agreements signed under the influence, witnesses who didn't remember signing at all. And scattered throughout, names, not full names but enough to sketch the outlines of a map that if you filled it in, would burn half of the entertainment industry to the ground. Reading it felt like stepping through a door that you knew you weren't supposed to open. Every page dared you to stop, to look away, but once you started, you couldn't. I found myself holding my breath without realizing it. This wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a book. It was a wound with page numbers. By the time I reached the end of the first packet, I felt like I needed to wash my hands. My stomach knotted, a tight, ugly thing. There were personal details, too. Things that cut deeper than any headline ever could. Descriptions of how Cassie's world shrank year by year, party by party, until she didn't know where she ended and someone else began. Of how silence became her survival instinct. Of how, Even after she left, she could still hear the music playing, warped, broken, pulling her backward. Burned down stuck with me more than anything. You don't survive places like that. You just leave pieces behind until there's nothing left to take. I sat there, long after I was supposed to be done logging the file, just staring at the last page, hands trembling slightly, feeling a sick heat rising in my chest. I knew none of this was public. None of this was supposed to be seen, not by me, not by anyone who still wanted to believe that success meant safety, that fame meant protection. The real question now was whether any of it would ever make it into open court. I resealed the file by hand, making sure the chain of custody was spotless. I wasn't about to be the weak link that someone pointed at when this thing exploded. But I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unfeel it. And when I walked out of the archive room that day, blinking against the brighter lights of the hallway, the courthouse felt different again. Not just heavy now, not just tense. It felt rotten, like something deep under the foundation had cracked open and started leaking into the air. Nobody said anything when I dropped the file into the secure vault. Nobody asked. But when I passed the main floor, I caught sight of a few faces, reporters, clerks, even one of the marshals, looking around like they could feel it too. Something was coming, not just for Combs, for everyone who had ever danced too close to the music. And some of them weren't ready for what was about to be played. Chapter 3. The Motion to Seal. The morning after logging Cassie's draft felt heavier, like every step inside the courthouse was dragging through mud. It wasn't just the humidity either. People were moving slower, talking lower. Even the security checkpoint had a strange rhythm to it, the metal detectors beeping out of sync like they were struggling to keep pace with the tension buzzing through the walls. Inside courtroom 7B, the lights felt harsher than usual, bleaching the color out of the wood-paneled walls and throwing long shadows under every bench. I slid into my spot near the back, where I could monitor filings and quietly note any changes without drawing attention. I wasn't the only one watching from the sidelines that day. There were more plainclothes officers than usual tucked against the walls, and some faces I didn't recognize. People who didn't belong to either side, who didn't belong to any side you could name publicly. It was motion day. Specifically, the motion to seal the videos. The ones everyone whispered about, but no one had dared describe out loud. Diddy's lawyers wasted no time. His lead counsel, a thin man with hair combed so tight it looked stapled to his scalp, stood tall at the lectern, voice crisp and mechanical. He didn't talk about facts. He didn't talk about justice. He talked about prejudice. "These materials," he said, tapping his fingers nervously against a stack of papers, "are sensational in nature. Their introduction to the jury would create an irreversible bias against Mr. Combs. Their probative value is negligible. Their prejudicial impact, catastrophic." He used words like irrelevant and inflammatory the way a drowning man flails for a life preserver. Each one sounded thinner than the last. From where I sat, I could see Diddy hunched over at the defense table, scribbling something furiously on a yellow legal pad. His lawyer barely glanced at him. Across the aisle, the prosecution waited. Patient, still. Like hunters who knew the trap had already been sprung and just needed the animal to wear itself out. When they rose to respond, it wasn't with fire and brimstone like you'd expect from TV dramas. No shouting, no grandstanding, just cold, brutal precision. The defense would have you believe these videos are isolated, irrelevant. They are not, the lead prosecutor said, holding up a thick folder marked Confidential Evidence ESIM 443 to 477. They are proof of a consistent, orchestrated pattern of behavior. They are not incidental. They are central. There was a silence after she spoke, a strange kind of vacuum that pulled the air out of the room. Even the court reporter's fingers hovered mid-air above her keys for a second longer than usual. Everyone was trying not to think about what they were actually talking about. The freak-offs. The gatherings where, according to Cassie's notes and at least 3 other witness statements now quietly filed under seal, the line between consent and command blurred into something you couldn't unsee once it was described. The tapes weren't just videos of parties. They were records, catalogs, maybe even trophies. I glanced toward the hallway doors, half expecting someone to burst in and call everything off. A mistrial, a bomb threat, anything to stop what was barreling forward. Instead, the whispering started. It always does around here, but that day it felt electric, dangerous. One clerk muttered near the filing counter that they'd heard the videos had been quietly flagged by higher-ups weeks ago, that certain friends of the court, the kind who never officially appear on dockets, had started making calls, trying to convince the judge to consider broader implication. Someone else said the word Oprah under their breath, followed by a quick glance over the shoulder. No elaboration, just a name dropped like a hot coal you didn't want to hold onto too long. It was the kind of whisper you didn't repeat in memos or mention during lunch breaks, the kind you stored away in the back of your mind where plausible deniability lived. The judge, for his part, looked like a man who had already decided. He didn't interrupt the defense's second volley of arguments, but he didn't look convinced either. Every time they used words like unfair or damaging, his mouth twitched in a way that made my stomach knot tighter. It wasn't about fairness anymore. Not really. When they argued to keep the evidence hidden, it wasn't about protecting the jury. It was about protecting the illusion that anyone in that room had ever been clean. The lawyers tried one more angle before giving up. A long, winding argument about cultural context, how certain environments have different standards of behavior, and how judging those environments with a rigid, moralistic lens would be fundamentally unjust. The room grew colder by degrees. It was a bad play. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman with a silver bob and a bright blue sweater, blinked slowly, like she couldn't believe she was hearing this. Another juror shifted uncomfortably in his seat, crossing and uncrossing his legs. The prosecution's reply was simple. They read a short excerpt from a witness statement, just enough to make the point. Consent was never asked, it was assumed, and if you hesitated, there were consequences. No names, no dates, just that. The silence afterward was brutal. The judge scribbled something on a notepad, then set his pen down with a finality that rang louder than any gavel. Hearing adjourned for lunch break. As people filtered out, the buzz in the hallway grew louder, sharper. You could hear scraps of it if you listened carefully enough. Talk of an emergency meeting upstairs in the administrative chambers, special prosecutors flying in, sealed transcripts being prepared just in case certain portions of the tapes got leaked. And behind it all, that same sick dread humming in the background. The fear wasn't just that the tapes existed. It was that once they were seen, really seen, nobody who touched them would walk away clean. Not the witnesses, not the lawyers, not even the system that pretended it could absorb something like this and move on. I stayed late that night, tucked behind my desk as the courthouse emptied out floor by floor. The cleaners came and went, polishing brass railings that didn't deserve to shine. Somewhere deep in the building, the evidence vaults hummed under lock and key, holding secrets that couldn't be locked away much longer. I found myself staring at the intake logs again, tracing the case numbers with the tip of my pen, memorizing them without meaning to. It didn't matter how many motions they filed. It didn't matter how much money changed hands behind closed doors. The tapes were real, and they were coming, whether any of us were ready for them or not. Chapter 4: The Hallway Incident. Courtroom 7B had never felt smaller than it did that morning. The walls seemed closer somehow, like the air inside had thickened overnight. Even the wood panels behind the judge's bench looked darker, slicker, like they'd been sweating. People spoke in clipped, low voices. Footsteps echoed too loud across the marble floors. Every little noise, a chair scraping, a folder snapping shut, felt amplified, out of place, wrong. They had wheeled in the evidence screens before anyone arrived. 3 large monitors bolted onto metal stands, heavy cables snaking across the floor and duct-taped down at the corners. I knew what that meant. Everyone did. Today something was going to be shown. Not just described, not just referenced, shown. The tension was so thick you could taste it, bitter, like old pennies pressed against your tongue. By 9 sharp, the room was packed. Full jury, defense team tight-shouldered and silent. Prosecutors lined up like soldiers, neat and cold and already holding their pens like weapons. Diddy sat at the defense table, wearing a navy blue suit that hung off him like it belonged to someone else. He was smaller than before, not physically maybe, but smaller. The kind of shrinking you only notice in people who realize they're not walking out the way they walked in. When the judge entered, the room jerked upright like marionettes on 2 short strings. No pleasantries, no preamble. Having considered the arguments presented, the judge said, voice low but clear enough to cut through the stillness, "The court finds the video evidence admissible. Proceed." The defense lawyer's shoulders slumped. Just a fraction. But I saw it. Everyone saw it. One of the tech clerks, a kid barely out of college by the looks of him, was already crouched by the monitors, keying in the playback sequence. His hands shook once as he punched the buttons, and I didn't blame him. The lights dimmed. The first few seconds of the footage came without sound, just grainy, washed-out hallway camera feed. Date and time stamped in the corner, late 2016. At first, there was nothing. Just an empty hotel hallway, too bright, too clean, carpet pattern buzzing in the old camera's eye. Then movement. Cassie stepped into frame first. She was barefoot, wearing loose sweats and a hoodie, her head low, moving fast, but not running, looking over her shoulder. A few seconds later, Diddy followed. It wasn't the kind of angry chase you see in movies. No shouting, no wild gestures. Just a steady, mechanical walk, like he was moving on a track, inevitable, unhurried. He caught up to her near the elevator. The first blow came fast, a backhand so sudden that even the camera seemed to lurch slightly at the motion. Cassie staggered sideways into the wall, her shoulder bouncing off the cheap frame of a hallway painting. She didn't fall, though. She caught herself, turned, raised her hands, palms out, a silent plea. Diddy's body language never changed. He moved like he wasn't seeing her at all, like she was just an obstacle, a thing in the way. The second hit sent her to the ground. No sound in the video, but you could almost hear the slap, the sick crack of contact. Cassie crumpled against the wall, hands over her head, trying to shield herself. He stood over her for a moment, just stood there, breathing heavily, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Then he stepped back, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, straightened his shoulders, and walked away, leaving her curled on the floor, too afraid or too broken to get up. The tape ended with her dragging herself upright slowly, one hand pressed to her temple, swaying slightly as she staggered toward the emergency stairs. The screen went black. Nobody moved. For a moment, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the whir of the ventilation system buzzing behind the walls. Then a gasp, sharp and involuntary, from the jury box. Someone, I think Juror 5, pressed both palms over her mouth, shoulders heaving slightly. Other juror, an older man with glasses sliding down his nose, wiped his hands on his pants over and over like he couldn't get them clean. I felt the bile rise in my throat and swallowed it down hard. I had watched evidence 100 times before. Crime scene photos, Murder confession tapes, surveillance of things so ugly they didn't seem real. But I had never seen something that looked less like a man and more like a machine winding down, losing control. Diddy didn't flinch as the video played, didn't blink, didn't react at all. It was his lawyer who gave it away. Midway through the second blow, the defense attorney's jaw tightened so hard you could see the pulse hammering in his temple. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table. Email. They all knew. And didn't say a word afterward. They didn't need to. The footage had spoken louder than any argument ever could. The judge cleared his throat, a rough, scraping sound, and instructed the court to recess for 15 minutes. Maybe longer. I stayed seated as the courtroom emptied out around me, people rushing for the doors, needing air, needing distance. Outside in the hallways, the noise swelled immediately, voices raised, phones buzzing, footsteps slamming across the tile. Reporters trying to pretend they hadn't already written their headlines in their heads. Clerks trying not to look too shaken. Even some of the guards couldn't meet each other's eyes. I stayed still, hands gripping the edges of my seat, heart hammering too hard in my chest. That footage wasn't the worst of it. It was just the beginning. The real horror wasn't in the hits. It was in the aftermath. The knowledge that there were more tapes, more nights, more corridors just like that one, hidden behind hotel walls and closed doors and paid for silences. And that for every camera that caught it, there were 100 nights that nobody would ever see. Not on a monitor, not in a courtroom, not anywhere. But those ghosts were still out there, and they were starting to whisper. One case officer's private thought, this wasn't going to be a trial. It was going to be an exorcism. And there wouldn't be enough prayers in the world to clean what was about to crawl out into the light. Chapter 5. The Coerced Procedure. The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been that morning. After the hallway footage played, something in the air fractured. It wasn't just the way people moved slower, or the way every word seemed heavier coming out of their mouths. It was deeper than that. Like the whole room was sagging under a weight nobody could name out loud yet. The afternoon session started late. Everyone needed more time than 15 minutes to pull themselves together, but court schedules didn't care about emotions. Judges didn't care either, at least not in the way normal people think. Justice moves on a track, and once it starts rolling, it doesn't stop for anyone's broken heart. I was back in my spot before the judge returned, files stacked neatly, pen capped and ready. I didn't know what was coming next, but after that morning I knew it wouldn't be better. When the judge finally took the bench again, he didn't waste time with niceties. Next item for review, he said, voice rough. Supplemental witness statement and supporting exhibits filed under Motion 12G. Nobody needed it spelled out. Motion 12G had arrived late, barely 36 hours before today's session, filed quietly, almost like they were hoping it would slip by without too much noise. It did. The prosecution rose first. A different lawyer this time, younger, sharper, with a voice that cut through the heavy silence without needing to shout. She explained, carefully, that a new witness had come forward, not a direct participant in the events being litigated, but someone who had personal, first-hand knowledge of certain practices associated with Mr. Combs' private gatherings, specifically practices meant to mitigate potential liabilities. The language was clinical, dry, almost absurd. You could feel the words struggling to stay locked inside their professional boxes, but they bled out anyway. Because what she was really saying was this. After certain parties, the ones Cassie hinted at, the ones others had described in half-whispered nightmares, some women were allegedly taken to private clinics and forced to undergo medical procedures. To make sure, as the prosecution put it, no evidence remained. It hit the room like a slap. The exhibit cart rattled as a clerk wheeled it forward, a battered metal tray holding a stack of sealed plastic envelopes. Inside each one, carefully labeled, copies of medical intake forms, billing statements from private cash-only clinics, redacted witness statements linking the procedures to specific dates and locations. No hospital names anyone would recognize, no big city clinics where staff might talk too much. These were places buried deep in the outskirts, anonymous storefronts with paper-thin walls and doctors who didn't ask questions they didn't want answers to. And there, at the bottom of the pile, tucked almost like an afterthought, a receipt, single-line item, emergency intervention service, dated 2 days after a party at one of Combs' rented properties. It was real. Stamped, signed, paid in full. I felt my hand tighten around my pen so hard I thought it might snap in half. Some documents bleed. These bled in invisible ink across every life that touched them. Across the defense table, I watched as the cracks finally started showing. One of Diddy's attorneys leaned in close, whispering fiercely to the lead counsel. You didn't have to hear the words to understand. It was the body language, the short, stabbing motions of someone trying to patch a sinking ship without enough fingers. Another member of the team, a woman who had looked polished and collected at the start of the trial, suddenly began rifling through her briefcase like she couldn't find what she needed fast enough. Her face had gone pale, almost translucent under the courtroom lights. Even Diddy seemed rattled now. For the first time since the trial began, he wasn't staring blankly ahead like a man playing dead. He was shifting in his seat, jaw-grinding, hands twitching against the cuffs of his tailored jacket sleeves. He wasn't in control anymore. He knew it. The judge's expression didn't change much, but there was a tightness around his mouth, a hardening of the eyes that hadn't been there earlier. This evidence will be admitted for the limited purpose of establishing a pattern of post-ament conduct, he said. A simple sentence, dry, bureaucratic, but it cracked something wide open in the room. Behind me, someone let out a slow, shuddering breath. Too loud, too raw to be mistaken for anything else. Outside the windows, the city kept moving like nothing had changed. Cars honking, birds weaving through the haze of late afternoon. Life pretending it didn't hear the foundation cracking under its feet. Inside, though, we all heard it. The system had been creaking for weeks, months, trying to hold up the illusion that this was just another trial, just another defendant, just another set of bad decisions being weighed against better ones. But you can't patch over rot forever. Eventually it seeps through the walls. And what was seeping through this case now wasn't just guilt or shame or even horror. It was something worse, a kind of complicity, and knowing. You could see it in the jurors' faces. A few were scribbling furiously in their notebooks, trying to keep up, but most weren't writing at all anymore. They were just staring, not at the evidence, not at the prosecution, not even at Diddy. They were staring at each other, at the realization that there weren't enough verdicts in the world to fix what they were seeing. Verdicts can punish, they can even destroy, but they can't erase. And what was being etched into the memory of everyone in that courtroom wasn't going to wash off with a guilty plea or a settlement check. It was permanent, written in the kind of ink that seeps into the bones. When court adjourned for the day, I didn't even bother packing up properly. I shoved my files into my bag and moved fast, keeping my head down. But even moving through the crowded hallways, weaving between reporters and marshals and shell-shocked staffers, I couldn't outrun it. That feeling, that knowing, the knowledge that the trial wasn't about headlines or careers anymore. It was about rot, and whether the building would survive once the beams were stripped bare. Because some evidence doesn't just prove a crime, it proves a system. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, no matter how tightly they try to seal the doors. Chapter 6. The Defense Crumbles. It was the last stretch of the day, but you could feel it, the walls closing in. Courtroom 7B, already stretched to its seams, felt smaller than ever. It was in the way people shifted in their seats, restless, like animals packed into too tight cages. It was in the stiff way the guards hovered near the doors, double-checking badges, watching every hand that moved a little too fast. Diddy had changed. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a controlled, and everybody knew it. The defense called their next witness, but it didn't matter. By then, it didn't matter who they put up there. Their whole foundation had cracked the moment Cassie's footage played, the moment the medical documents were read aloud. Now they were just trying to plug holes in a ship already sunk. The swinger lifestyle defense, the one they had hinted at during pre-trial motions, made its official debut. It was a bad fit from the start. The lead defense attorney, same one with the combed-back hair, now visibly sweating under the lights, launched into a speech about alternative relationship models, about consensual adult activities, about misunderstood private gatherings. He used words like exploration and community and freedom of choice. Every word felt like it fell a little flatter than the last, bouncing off the jury box and dying on the floor. Because the prosecution wasn't stupid. They let him talk, let him paint his rosy picture. And then they started the cross. Brick by brick, they tore it down. They didn't shout. They didn't wave their arms or pace dramatically. They just asked questions, calm, methodical questions that built on each other, like a slow, inevitable landslide. Questions about locked doors, about guests being told they couldn't leave, about contracts signed while intoxicated, about injuries treated off-site, away from real hospitals, about guests who didn't remember consenting to anything at all. One prosecutor, a woman with short, sharp gray hair and a voice like cold iron, leaned into the microphone and asked the witness straight out, "Would you describe an environment where you are told when to enter, when to leave, what substances to consume, and who to touch, all under threat of physical harm, as a consensual gathering?" The witness stammered, stumbled, looked at Diddy, who stared straight ahead like he couldn't even hear what was happening anymore. When the witness finally muttered something about complicated circumstances, the prosecutor smiled, the kind of smile you don't recover from. "Complicated," she repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air like a loaded trap. By the time she finished, you could feel the jury's mood crystallize. This wasn't about lifestyle choices. It wasn't about freedom. It was about cages. Some gilded, some velvet-lined, but cages all the same. I sat frozen at my desk, scribbling notes that didn't even make sense by the end. My hand was moving, but my mind was stuck on one thought, looping endlessly. Consent isn't a contract. It's a cliff, and someone else holds the rope. The judge called for a recess, and that's when the weirdness started. A sealed bench conference. Now, sealed conferences aren't unheard of, but this one was different. Usually they happen for things like jury instructions or clarifying procedural issues. 5 minutes, maybe 10. This one dragged. 20 minutes. 30. The white noise machine buzzed around the bench, drowning out whatever was being said, but you could read it in the body language. Urgency, panic, calculation. The court clerks shifted uncomfortably at their desks. The bailiffs tightened their hands around their radios. Even the stenographer, who had seen more ugliness than most war correspondents, kept glancing nervously at the clock. When the conference finally broke up, the lawyers walked away looking like they had been sucker punched. No announcement was made to the court. No record would exist for public consumption. But the whispers started immediately. Third-party damage control. Somebody important, more important than even Combs, had their name hovering too close to the evidence pile. A call had been made. Vouch to save Diddy. That was already a lost cause. But to cut the rot off before it spread any further. To protect the rest of the network. Outside the courtroom, reporters were huddling in frantic knots, phones glued to their faces, their voices clipped and urgent. The first leaks were already slithering into the air. Nothing concrete yet, just a scent. A whiff of bigger blood coming. I watched it unfold like a man trapped behind glass, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop the avalanche once it started rolling. Inside the courtroom, the jurors returned slowly, filing into their seats with the dull resignation of people who know the next thing they're about to see will be worse than the last. The judge looked tired. Older somehow. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the room, and nodded once, a grim signal for the machine to lurch forward again. The final cross-examinations were brutal. Witnesses who had seemed composed earlier now buckled under the weight of their own half-truths. Defense attorneys objected at random, just trying to slow the bleeding. But it was no use. The prosecution had them cornered. Be pinned down under the reality that no amount of whispered consent could justify the world being exposed inside these walls. This wasn't about morality. It wasn't even about legality anymore. It was about something primal. A question every juror was being forced to ask themselves, silently, in the hollow of their chests. When you saw her on that hallway floor, did you really think she chose that? The answer was written on their faces, and no jury instructions in the world were going to scrub it away. When court finally adjourned for the night, the room didn't so much empty as leak bodies into the hallways, slow and stunned. No chatter, no wisdom there, just the dull shuffling of people carrying something too heavy for words. I packed my things mechanically, hands moving, brain still stuck on that sealed conference. Somewhere out there, someone bigger was sweating bullets. Someone bigger was wondering if their name would survive the night. And me. I was just wondering how much longer the walls could hold before the whole damn courthouse came crashing down. Chapter 7. The Sealed Names. The morning before the verdict felt like standing inside a thundercloud, waiting for it to split open. You could hear the pressure building, feel it pressing down against your ribs, making every breath come a little harder. The courthouse hallways were quieter than usual. No buzzing reporters, no clattering heels or murmured gossip around the coffee stands. It was as if everyone had agreed, without saying a word, that today wasn't for noise. It was for waiting. I had just finished my first cup of coffee, cold already, bitter as regret, when the assignment came through, a sealed delivery. No signature required, just a handoff and a destination. Vault Room C. The envelope they gave me wasn't much to look at. Plain brown again, but heavier than most. It didn't flap loosely when I tucked it under my arm. It sat there like a brick, solid and unmovable. Walking it down the service hallways, past the half-lit emergency lights and the chipping paint, I let myself wonder for the first time in weeks what the end of this trial would even look like. Would Diddy even make it to sentencing? Would the system do what it always did? Slap a few wrists, shield a few names, and quietly rearrange the chessboard? I wasn't naive enough to hope for justice anymore. But I still wondered. Vault Room C was colder than usual. They kept it like that on purpose, said it was to preserve the paper, slow the decay. Standing there under the humming fluorescent tubes, you could almost believe you were underwater, deep inside some forgotten wreck. The logbook was waiting on the intake desk. I scribbled my initials, time-stamped it, then peeled the tape off the envelope's seam with a slow, steady pull. Inside were 3 thick manila folders. No covers, no titles, just stacks of documents clipped together in heavy bunches. I slipped on gloves, standard procedure for unsealed evidence. and started sorting, eyes flicking from header to header. It didn't take long to realize what I was looking at. Lists, names, deeds, white manifests, guest lists, not for weddings or birthdays, for retreat, for private weekends, for industry gatherings. Some of the names were expected, people whose reputations had always carried a sour undercurrent if you knew where to listen. Places, club owners, executives with wide smiles and dead eyes. But some names didn't belong there. They were bigger, shinier. Names I had seen on book covers, on TV interviews talking about empowerment and legacy and lifting others up. I found my hand hesitating over one page, my stomach knotting into something sharp and hard. There, tucked into the margin of a guest manifest, handwritten in what looked like a rushed scrawl, a set of initials. 2 letters. Familiar. World famous. I didn't say them out loud. Didn't even let myself whisper them in the empty room. But they sat there anyway, heavy and undeniable. And just below them, half scratched out, another name, not fully legible but enough to guess. Enough to ruin a dozen legacies if the right person decided to speak it into a microphone. The folder trembled slightly in my hands, not from any breeze, but from the realization sinking in deeper than it had ever sunk before. The files didn't just name people. They named realities we had all agreed politely to pretend were impossible. Realities where the parties weren't just parties. Russian contracts weren't just business deals. Where freedom was something bartered in the quiet back rooms of gilded mansions and neon-lit yachts. I snapped the folders closed faster than I meant to, heart hammering against my ribs. Chain of custody. That was all I was responsible for. Not justice, not exposure. Just making sure the papers got from point A to point B without disappearing. I slid the folders into the sealed archive box, locked it, triple-checked the serial code, and logged it into the permanent record. Permanently sealed, permanently hidden. Unless, of course, someone had the stomach to dig it up later. Walking back through the silent hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had brushed against something alive, something breathing. Owned it was still out there, slithering through boardrooms and sound stages, slipping between handshakes and charity galas. Not dead, not exposed, just wounded. But that afternoon, when court resumed for the last procedural motions, I watched the defense team with new eyes. Watched Diddy stare blankly ahead, jaw clenched so tight his temples pulsed. Watched the prosecutors flick glances at each other like they knew there was more rot buried than they'd ever be allowed to dig up. The jury shuffled back in, exhausted and brittle. The judge shuffled papers, voice dry and methodical as he scheduled the formal reading of the verdict for the next day. And outside, the city moved on. Taxis honking, construction hammering steel against steel. The noise of a world not ready to listen, not ready to believe. But the names were there now, written down, tucked away in frozen rooms and locked vaults, and memories that wouldn't stay quiet forever. And whether the world was ready or not, as if silence was running out of places to hide. Chapter 8. The Final Strike. The building felt different that morning. Not heavier, not buzzing with tension like the other days. It was something else. It was hollow, as if the courthouse itself had already made up its mind, had already moved on, and the bodies inside were just finishing the motions. I walked through security half asleep, barely registering the wand sweep or the rubber gloves brushing past my waist. I didn't need caffeine to wake up today. The final hearing had been carved into my bones. Everyone's, really. They didn't announce it officially as sentencing day. There were still motions pending, procedures that needed to be respected, but we all knew. The jury had deliberated fast. The final phase was inevitable now. The room was packed, but not chaotic. No buzz. No reporters lunging for position. No last-minute appeals whispered behind closed doors. It was a funeral. The court officers moved slower. The clerks shuffled their papers with care, as if noise itself would be disrespectful. And then the door was opened and he walked in. John Combs, or whatever was left of him. He wasn't shackled at the ankles this time, but he might as well have been. His suit, another dark, sharp thing, hung off him like a scarecrow's costume. His hair had grown out just enough to look unruly, gray showing at the temples. His skin sagged under his eyes, too many sleepless nights etched into bruised hollows. But it wasn't the physical decay that struck you. It was the silence inside him, like he was already gone, and the body just hadn't gotten the memo yet. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't scan the room for familiar faces. He didn't nod at his lawyers or even flinch when the bailiff called the court to order. He just sat, howled, waiting. The judge took the bench without ceremony. No introductions, no recitations, no pleasantries. He stared down at the room like a man surveying the wreckage after the storm had already torn the roof off. And then he spoke. It wasn't a ruling, not yet. It wasn't even a formal speech. Who said the translation app was creating a unique opportunity. It was something closer to a reckoning. He didn't just talk about Sean Combs. He talked about system, about how fame had been weaponized, how loyalty had been bought and sold like bloodless currency, about the way entire industries had built glass castles out of silence, brick by brick, window by window, knowing full well the bodies they were stacking up inside to hold the walls steady, about how people had mistaken applause for absolution, about how success didn't erase violence, didn't scrub out cruelty, didn't bleach away the rot. The judge's voice never rose, never broke. He just laid it out, slow, heavy, deliberate, as if he were chipping words into a tombstone none of us would ever be able to walk past without looking down. I watched the jurors across the aisle. Some sat rigid, faces blank, masks carved by exhaustion. Others blinked too fast, fighting against the sting in their eyes. Nobody smiled. Nobody smirked. Even Diddy's lawyers didn't pretend to argue anymore. They sat slumped in their chairs, hands folded tight over their briefs, as if wishing they could make themselves invisible. Diddy, he didn't move at all. He just stared at the far wall, jaw slack, as if whatever was left inside him had finally, mercifully broken free and left the body behind. No entourage now. No photographer. No velvet ropes. No whispered promises of redemption lurking just outside the frame. Only the courtroom. Only the verdict of silence. As the judge spoke, I caught a glimpse of something through the side hall where the clerks staged the overflow evidence. A brown folder. The same kind we had seen tucked under the judge's arm that first day, back when this all still seemed like it could be managed, massaged, spun. But this one was different. Bigger. It wasn't plain anymore. Stamped across the front in heavy black letters. Archive, on seal. I felt my stomach twist at the sight of it. Because that was the real verdict. Not the years he might serve. Not the fines or reparations. It was memory. And it was no longer locked behind polished doors and notarized lies. It had been cracked open. It was bleeding into the fabric of everything now. The music, the interviews, the legacy, the myth. There would be no rebuilding it. Not this time. No, not ever. Because you can clean up a crime. You can buy silence. You can even rewrite a few lines of history if you have enough lawyers and money and airtime. But once memory leaks into the air, once it seeps into the cracks of the world itself, you can't scrub it out. You can only live with the stink of it, long after the cameras pack up, long after the sentencing is filed, long after the man himself fades into some distant cautionary tale whispered over empty bar stools. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about memory, and whether monsters could still afford to be forgotten. As the court adjourned and people rose to file out in silence, I stayed seated for a while, watching the dust motes spin in the slanted sunlight, listening to the echo of footsteps dying away, one by one, feeling the cold weight of the brown folder burned into the back of my skull. Gone, knowing somehow that no matter how many stories they tried to tell later, no matter how many redemption arcs or second chances or sanitized biographies came rolling down the line, the real story had already been written, scratched into the walls of this courthouse, etched into the silence between breaths, carved into the marrow of everyone who had sat here and witnessed the end of an empire built on broken backs. And it wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. Not ever.